of DVB. It costs about 10,000 euro per year, and that's not counting travel for meetings and things of that nature. Just the membership fee to get the brass plaque to put up on the wall that says we're DVB members is 10,000 euro per year. So we got generous support from the MacArthur Foundation in the United States to allow us to participate. So we proposed a number of things in our several years of DVB participation. We wanted to defend the ability of people to use open source technology in connection with DVB. We wanted to maintain some existing kinds of compatibility and interoperability. So this didn't work out very well. I'm part of a group of Latin enthusiasts, and I remember I went to a dinner after one of the DVB meetings, and I was describing how the meeting went. And I said, well, it's sort of like, Socii concilium habeo, quid ni id non faciamus. And they say, est concilium pessimum, which is to say, hey guys, I have an idea. How about we don't do that? That's a terrible idea. So we didn't get a very warm reception. DVB has a concept that they have certain constituencies that are the official constituencies, and they include things like technology companies and broadcasting companies. And open source developers are not a recognized class of constituency. They do have a rule that nobody has a veto at DVB. So if they're doing something that you think is bad for you, you can't actually stop it, provided that a certain number of other people, a certain number of other organizations from the existing recognized constituencies want to work on it. DRM is very much something that a number of people from a number of existing recognized DVB constituencies do want to work on. At present, of the three leading DTV systems, ATSC in the United States, ISDBT in Japan, I'm sorry, I wrote down US again. That should say Europe at the bottom. Sorry? Not yet. Oh, well, the US sort of has ATSC. They're trying. You've got to give them credit for that, right? So at least with regard to free-to-air terrestrial broadcast, that's getting digital TV over the air from a tower, the DVB system has the least DRM of any of the leading systems because they haven't even completed a spec for doing any DRM with regard to free-to-air TV. And in the US, they've completed a spec, and there's a legal fight about whether anyone has to follow it. In the Japanese system, it's built into the system from the very beginning, and everything's encrypted end-to-end. So that's kind of the worst case. So in many regards, free-to-air as well as conditional access, which I'll talk about a little bit later on, DVB is actually in a really good situation right now. It's sort of an example of the fact that you can have a modern digital television system without DRM, which is a proposition that's not really obvious to everyone. And so if you go around the world and you say to people, for example, in less developed countries who are talking about what digital television system to adopt, you can say, well, look, there are systems that don't have DRM. And DRM is not an inevitability. It's not a technical necessity. And the European DVB system doesn't have DRM. And that's pretty nice for Europeans, and it's pretty nice for other countries that might choose to adopt the system in its present form. Of course, if that were the whole story, I wouldn't be here right now. So back in the US, we've gotten a lot of things wrong. And unfortunately, some of those things are things that some people are quite proud of. And digital television is just one area where we've made some mistakes that people are really excited about. In this case, the entertainment industries are very excited about their successes at imposing DRM and technical restrictions in the US. And they say, you know, we've made progress in assuring content security, and now we need to make similar kinds of progress in other jurisdictions. This happens in a lot of areas of copyright. There's a whole office of the US government, the Office of the United States Trade Representative, and one of the major jobs of the trade representative is to travel all around the world and make threats to other countries to get them to adopt US-style copyright law. And that's been working really well from the point of view of the copyright industries. The US Trade Representative has gotten a lot of influence and a lot of success in getting other countries to pattern their laws on US copyright law, which is quite restrictive in many regards. And so we actually have a similar situation going on with regard to digital television, because the entertainment industries have said that they need DRM, it's essential, that there's no choice in the matter, and they're having some success in the US. And unfortunately, in all the years that we went to DVB meetings, we kept hearing US DRM initiatives held up as examples. People would say, well, we know, we need a broadcast flag-like thing, just like in the US. We need a thing like the US cable plug-and-play system, which I'm about to talk about. So here's our US mistake number 1, called cable plug-and-play, also called cable card, also called a lot of other things. We have a notion that when you have a pay TV system as opposed to a free TV system, there's some kind of encryption, and the purpose of the encryption is to make people pay for the TV services. The mechanism for this is familiar to many people, either because they work in the industry or because they want to know about it for other reasons. What you're really paying for when you subscribe to a pay TV service is a stream of keys known as control words, which are able to decrypt the programming. Because you have a situation where you have a shared medium, like a coaxial cable that passes by everybody's house, or a satellite that's beaming some kind of modulated signal to everybody in the entire footprint underneath the satellite. And so you can't not receive the signal in a certain sense. Everybody who's there in the footprint on the shared medium is going to receive the signal. But the signal is encrypted, and there are particular keys that are constantly changing, called control words, that are necessary in order to understand the signal. And so when you get a pay TV subscription, the pay TV company is agreeing that they're going to use their complicated technical infrastructure to make sure that equipment that you have that's specifically registered to you, specifically individually numbered, is going to get these keys that it will then be able to use to understand how to decrypt the programming that you've paid for. So historically, and in many cases even today, the mechanisms of actually doing this, of actually decrypting the programming, of distributing the keys for decrypting the programming, and so on, were totally proprietary. If you wanted to subscribe to a particular service, you had to get a set-top box, you had to get proprietary equipment from that operator. So a lot of people are kind of mad about this. It's kind of a limitation on innovation and competition, because you have this bottleneck, because if the pay TV operator is very conservative or doesn't care, then you don't get new features. Also, the set-top boxes don't really come down in price and don't really take advantage of new innovation. So a lot of people have complained about this and said, actually, there really ought to be a competitive market for these devices. The US Congress in 1996 passed a law that said, with regard to cable in the United States, there ought to be a competitive market for devices that can receive cable. They should be standardized. They delegated to the industry the power to create the standard in question. So this ended up causing some problems for us. One problem was that the industry wasn't in a big hurry to get the job done, and it took them years and years, and the system has still not been properly implemented in the US. And this is 10 years after the legal mandate to implement it. So one problem is the delay. But of course, that's not the only problem. The other problem is that the system is secret and proprietary, and to build a device, you have to get a license, and the license strictly regulates the functionality of the entire device. In particular, you have to impose, under the terms of the license, DRM after reception. That is, after you've verified that people have paid for something and you've decrypted it, then you've got to go and look up the DRM policy, and you've got to enforce the DRM policy against the user in the user's own living room. So technically, that wasn't necessary. You could have just said, did the user pay for this? Okay, the user paid for this. Okay, here's the MPEG stream. Unfortunately, the industry felt that they didn't have any reason to draw this distinction between conditional access, that is, did the user pay for it, and DRM, That is, what can the user do with it? What kind of devices can the user do it on? What abilities does the user have to make use of it? So conceptually, these are different, but there was no profit that the industry saw in maintaining that distinction. So we complained about this to our communications regulator. We said, wait a minute, Congress said that there should be this compatibility thing. Congress didn't say that there should be these restrictions on consumers as a part of that package. The FCC ruled against us. They said that this system was totally fine and was a legitimate example of what Congress might have had in mind. So that was kind of depressing for us. I also want to mention that in the US, this regime only applied to cable and not to satellite. In the US, we have only 2 mainstream commercial digital satellite companies called DirecTV and EchoStar. These companies are not subject to any kind of compatibility regime for their devices. So if you want to get their service, you have to get their set-top box. So this creates an interesting baseline question. Because we have this cable plug-and-play regime, we have these devices that are licensed, that do DRM, that restrict the users, and a lot of people in the industry say, this is a great step forward for consumers. Because the normal situation, if we didn't have this regulation, the normal situation is that all of the pay TV operators would hand you a set-top box, and whatever that set-top box did or didn't do would be the end of the story. You would have no recourse, you would have no other options. You would take their set-top box and you would like it. And so they say this cable system that has these restrictions is really good for consumers because at least consumers are guaranteed that the system can't be any more restrictive than that. And this argument is very persuasive to people in the industry because they say, you know, normally operators would have every right to impose any proprietary restriction they want. So any step away from that is more freedom than consumers really could have expected at the outset. Whereas you could say, well, compared to an open system, it's still extremely restrictive. They can still prohibit you absolutely from recording certain programming, for example. And in a more open system, they wouldn't have that power. And the industry would probably respond, why did you think you were entitled to an open system? So moving on to mistake number 2, we have this DTV standard called ATSC. Since the satellite systems in the US are proprietary, as I mentioned, they don't actually use ATSC. So this is a distinction between the US situation and the European situation. Because here in Europe, DVB standards are used for satellite TV, for cable TV, and for free over-the-air broadcast. DVB-S, DVB-C, and DVB-T. We don't really have the equivalent situation in the US. We do have a DTV standard for broadcast, and it doesn't include encryption, perhaps because it was written about a decade ago. So the movie industry got really mad, but they got really mad on a kind of a late schedule, because they showed up after the system was standardized and after the system was adopted and implemented, and there were actually stations on the air broadcasting using it. And they said, wait a minute, why is there no DRM? That's unacceptable. So their response to this was not to actually try to change the standard, but rather to say, well, these devices, these manufacturers are being totally irresponsible because they're making devices that can just copy and can just record anything. And that's not really looking out and doing their part for the long-term health of the content ecosystem and the value chain. So we need to set these people right, and we need a little regulation to help them along, to help them see their way to doing something that's in the long-term interest of the content ecosystem. So their solution to this was a regulation that we call the broadcast flag, and the idea there is that you have an unencrypted signal, and you can understand it, but by law you have to pretend that it's encrypted, and you have to apply restrictions on the other end, as though it were restricted coming in. So I have an analogy to this. Imagine that a bunch of people were having their emails leaked to journalists, right? Like a corporate CEO sends out a sensitive memo in email, and then someone forwards it to a journalist, and then it shows up in the press, it shows up in the newspaper. So the CEO is really mad and says, look, these email software authors are being really irresponsible because they're making email software that has a forward button, and the forward button is always there, and